As it is, we have a wolf by the ear. We can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale and self-preservation the other. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the next installment of the Commemorative Halves series. Now, ironically, the next two coins are not commemorative halves. They are commemoratives, and they commemorate the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. There are two gold coins, but again, they're not halves. They're $5 gold quarter eagles. So why gold and why the quarter eagle? Well, simply put, there were two reasons for this. Number one was the fact that William McKinley was the one coordinating this. He had actually tried to coordinate the exposition prior to being assassinated. And in order to do so, they had to raise money. And in order to raise money, they thought that gold was going to be the most equitable. 250,000 of these, 150,000 of each, were proposed to be sold. Now, that was a very lofty goal, a very high number when you think the mintage probably should have been closer to 20 or 30,000. In fact, 14 years later, over 200,000 of these would be turned by Mr. Zerby and sent back to the mint to be melted down because they just couldn't sell them. The other reason for choosing gold is because in March 7th of 1900, President McKinley signed the Gold Standard Act. This fixed the value for all money issued whether by coin or in paper under a gold standard. Now, this made the gold bugs of the Northeast happy who pushed for a gold-backed based currency. Now, why would we have Thomas Jefferson? Now, Thomas Jefferson obviously was the one who coordinated the Louisiana Purchase. He had actually sent a delegate over to France to talk about the purchase of New Orleans. Now, it was just New Orleans. It wasn't anticipated that they were going to be looking for the entire Louisiana territory. So they wanted Florida and New Orleans. Now, New Orleans was an important port, and all of the free trade that came down the Mississippi ended in New Orleans. And it was very important for the United States to maintain the ownership of that. So they had actually went to France to proposition King Louis of this. But Mr. Livingston, who went with a delegate, actually knew that they were going to offer more. And in fact, King Louis did offer more and offered all of it, all 828,000. The purchase price, $15 million, about $11.5 million in cash, and then about $3.5 million in forgiven debts. An amazing price point when you think that it was only about 5 or 6 cents per acre. But this is not what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about today is the tumultuous nature of the purchase itself. See, William McKinley understood a lot of the history regarding this. He was a proud American, fought in the American-Spanish War, gained territories, grew the U.S. himself, but understood one thing. And this one thing was a comment that was made in an address that he made to Congress. Now, many of us could listen to this and take a little bit from this. In his first address to Congress, McKinley reminded Americans to refrain from fractionalism. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to listen to this very carefully. He said to question foreign policy, those things of revenue, the soundness of your currency, the involatility of the national obligation, the improvement of the public service, to appeal to the individual conscience of every earnest citizen, regardless of the party or what portion of the country they reside in. Ladies and gentlemen, very forward thinking. President McKinley understood many history's lessons. And the lesson that I'm about to share with you now is why President McKinley wanted the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. I'm going to reference 3 letters. A letter by Thomas Jefferson to John Holmes, a letter by Alexander Hamilton on the Louisiana Purchase, and then a letter by Rufus King to Timothy Pickering. Now, if you don't know who these people are, I'll put some information in the description to let you know a little bit about who these people were. But Thomas Jefferson to John Holmes stated this: as it is, we have a wolf by the ear. We can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale and self-preservation the other. Now, what he was talking about here is he was talking about the burden and the problem and the potential expansion of slavery from the Louisiana Purchase. Alexander Hamilton on this purchase would write, "But may it be added that our own citizens become desirous of settling this country and immigrate thither." It means elsewhere. Too wide a dispersed population must hasten the dismemberment of a large portion of our country, the dissolution of the government. On a whole, we think it may be said that whether the possession at this time of any territory west of the Mississippi River be advantageous, it at best is extremely problematic. What he was saying in this time frame is that our expansion westward was going to uproot many Native American tribes. It was also going to cause massive problems for a primarily eastern seaboard government to maintain and represent taxes. We had already had a problem with this in one state. And he saw the writing on the wall, and he wanted to address the fact that we were going to have problems. There were going to be unfair political decisions made at the expense of a native and indigenous population. And in fact, if we look back through history, Alexander Hamilton was spot on. Going back to the other issue, Rufus King wrote to Timothy Pickering, and he said, "As slavery is authorized and exists in Louisiana, will not the present of inequality arising from the representation of those slaves be increased, as the provision of the Constitution on this subject may be regarded as one of its greatest blemishes, it would be with reluctance that one could consent to being extended to the Louisiana Purchase." What they're saying here is extremely important. It's an ideology. It's a judgment call for those slave-owning states to count those slaves as representatives, delegates, under the official person who was running in that state. Meaning that the electoral college that was there would be increased solely based off of the number of slaves that a slave owner had. This gave an unfair representation in a vote by the slave owners. This was a major problem. And what Rufus King was saying is that if we purchase this, we have to make sure that that doesn't carry through the remainder of the United States. The representation should only be the people that are allowed to vote. This is why the emancipation of slaves and the voting opportunities for not only the women of that time frame, we have women's suffrage coming up here in a couple decades, but we also have the civil rights movement that would be plagued by this for years. They saw the writing on the wall, and they wanted to make sure that that expansion didn't duplicate the amount of ownership or the unfair voting rights for that particular state. And it was a great foresight. So there were a lot of issues regarding the Louisiana Purchase and major concerns over the endeavor. Ultimately, the Louisiana Purchase turned out to be a good thing. That territory would be separated into a number of states. Those states would create their own borders, which would be later founded. They would independently come inside the Union in varying parts, and we'll see that through the remainder of this particular series. But it's important to understand that just because we commemorate something doesn't necessarily mean that it was a good thing. To commemorate something is to remember the good, the bad, the ugly. Remember how it affected our nation, the decisions that were made so that we don't repeat it. That nation that ignores history is doomed to repeat it. Again, ladies and gentlemen, let us live in the words of President McKinley. Americans refrain from fractionalism. Questions of foreign policy, revenue, the soundness of currency, the involatility of the nation's obligations, the improvement of public service, appeal to the individual conscience of every earnest citizen, regardless of party or portion of the country they may reside. Thank you for being here today. Take those words to heart and remember that we have the capability to change the course of our nation for the better. Next week, we're going to be talking about the Lewis and Clark Exposition and the gold dollar that was minted from 1904 to 1905, commemorating the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition, which took place in Portland, Oregon. All right, folks, be well, be blessed, and as always, I will see you in the streams. See you next week.